All right, look, thank you very much. This session has quite a lot of technology, so we're just making sure that that's all set up. My name's Darian-Smith. I'm really pleased to be here. It's been a great day so far, and I've learnt a lot along the way, but I'm here to talk about a session on democracy and the academy, and I suspect that this is a topic of interest to everyone in the room. I certainly hope it is, because this is about, for those of us who are in universities, the role of our institution and our daily lives and our daily work. So we have our speaker, Professor Adrienne Stone, who will be talking to us in a virtual way. There will be then two discussants and time to have questions. So Adrienne Stone is a Melbourne Laureate Professor, Director of the Centre for Comparative Constitutional Studies here at the Melbourne Law School. And she researches in the areas of constitutional law and constitutional theory, freedom of expression and academic freedom. And I think her work will be known to many here in the room. She's talking here with work that comes from her most recent book, Open Minds, Academic Freedom and Freedom of Speech, co-authored with Carolyn Evans. And unfortunately, Adrienne couldn't be here today. She's travelling, but we do have a pre-record, and she's very keen, I know this, to hear comments and have feedback, so that could be emailed to her as well. So I'm just going to hand it over to the screens and come and sit down and watch and hope that works.
Hello, I'm Adrienne Stone from Melbourne Law School, and I'm really pleased to have this opportunity today to talk to you as part of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia Symposium on the Future of Democracy. I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person, or at least by Zoom, but some travel commitments have prevented me. Nonetheless, I acknowledge that I am presently on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I did the work that led to this presentation, of course, while living and working on that land. My topic today is academic freedom and democracy. It builds on some work that I have done in a book published with Carolyn Evans, but it is also especially in relation to the part that relates to the democratic principle at a relatively early stage, and I'd be extremely happy to receive your thoughts and suggestions. So turning to what I want to say, the central argument I want to make today is that universities properly conceived are important institutions of democracy, and that we need to attend to universities and to academic inquiry as elements of, or perhaps preconditions for, healthy democratic government. In this sense, academic freedom should be understood, and here I revert to my principal academic orientation towards constitutional law. Academic freedom should be understood as a matter of constitutional significance. So in my presentation today, I'll begin with the concept of academic freedom itself, exploring its nature and the purposes it serves, though for this audience, I will say relatively little, given that I think these principles are or should be relatively well understood. I then turn to the connections between academic freedom and democracy, and focus specifically on the role of universities in securing the epistemic foundation for democracy. And it's at this point that the value of academic freedom emerges. The last part of what I want to say today will examine some of the consequences of my argument for the way we think about universities and academic freedom in a constitutional democracy. Let me turn then to say something briefly about academic freedom. As I conceive it, it is the claim that those engaged in academic inquiry, principally academics, but also some others, are entitled to certain privileges and freedoms that are not enjoyed by all employees of the university, nor accorded to other professional enterprises. As commonly understood, the core activities to which academic freedom applies are research, and here I include publication, and public commentary within one's area of research and disciplinary expertise, teaching, and critically, for it's often overlooked, criticism of university governance, including public criticism. So those are the three elements. The principal justification for the freedom lies in the fact that universities contribute to the public good by advancing the search for and disseminating knowledge through teaching and research. Now, simply stated, that argument, of course, has much intuitive appeal, but a full justification confronts some difficult issues. And we address these in Carolyn Evans and I address these in our book, Open Minds, Academic Freedom and Freedom of Speech. We consider a number of issues, including how academic freedom survives sceptical accounts of the nature of academic inquiry that rely either on scepticism of the idea of truth or of the capacity of humans to identify it, or appeal to the objectivity, or to the impossibility of objectivity in academic inquiry. Now, having just pointed out those objections, in the end, I basically put them to one side. I don't share the scepticism about the value of academic inquiry, and I don't believe it's widely shared either inside or outside the academy. The value of academic research and the knowledge it produces seems to me to be manifold and obvious. And regarding claims of objectivity, let me just simply say this, that I conceive of the university as pursuing knowledge that encompasses moral, religious, ideological and political claims, as well as aesthetic and artistic judgments. So we accept, of course, that knowledge in this sense has a human face. It bears the imprint of the researcher. It's always somewhat provisional, may be subject to reasonable disagreement that persists even in the faith of good faith inquiry. Now, this account of academic freedom is heavily reliant on the idea that academic inquiry pursues knowledge in distinctive ways through disciplines that are characterised by methods and standards designed to ensure expertise and independence. So mastering the research methods and understanding the discipline is an important part of the research training that we all undertake. And among other things, these disciplinary methods insist on evidence and justification in certain forms, and they expose ideas to invalidation. They also require independent judgment. Therefore, while academic methods, disciplinary standards can be contested, academic freedom requires that they're contested by those who are working in the discipline. And indeed, working within a discipline and at the same time contesting its boundaries and exploring linkages with other disciplines is a fairly standard form of academic work. So we accept all that. But we do argue that the development and adoption of disciplinary methods and standards makes university research unique. They give academics expertise and independence. And it is a distinctive form of independence. So, for instance, while journalists are committed to independence and have their own set of journalistic ethics that also govern their search for truth, they neither have the research expertise, typically, and consequently do not have the broad research mission of universities. Think tanks and commercial research organisations, on the other hand, they may aim to advance knowledge across a broad range of research areas and may house researchers with special expertise, but they may not, and often do not, have the independence of the university academic. So academic freedom, therefore, exists to ensure that universities can pursue knowledge through academic inquiry, that itself is a public good, for there are so many ways in which our lives materially benefit and benefit in other ways from the very fact of advancing knowledge. But I want to focus on the democratic contribution of this search for knowledge. So to do that, I need to turn to consider the social role of universities. Now, universities are complex institutions and they perform many social roles. They are important engines of the economy, and we do hear a lot about this. Earlier this year, the chair of Universities Australia, speaking to the Press Club, opened by emphasising that education is Australia's largest export that we, quote, don't dig out of the ground. And universities are also important drivers of social mobility. And I think here, particularly something like Julia Gillard's vision of a university. A university education is a reliable way to improve your life opportunities, your children's life opportunities, and assure them a better life in the future. And with the growth in skills required by an economy dependent on new technology, it's probably more important than ever, for simple reasons of equity, that citizens can access skills and knowledge of a university degree. In addition, universities play an important role in civil society. And what I've just said is probably needed just some immediate explanation, because the idea of civil society usually deployed to describe the realm of voluntary and private action separate from the state. And a public university established under and governed according to statute does not easily fit that description. But whether or not we conceive of universities as institutions of civil society themselves, I think it is certainly true that universities provide important forums for private activity, and they support and amplify the activities of civil society. I'm thinking of things like forums for sports and recreation groups, faith-based organisations, political organisations, non-governmental organisations. In doing so, I think universities, in important ways, support the capacity of students to live freely and to pursue their own interests as they see them. Now, all of those things, civil society, driving the economy, improving social mobility, are important roles. But for the purposes of what I want to say today, I want to emphasise the way in which universities support democracy through their teaching and research activity. So that's my principal interest. Now, this kind of an argument can be put in two ways. The first, which is probably the more common, relies on the power of a university education, not specific on civics education, but the idea of a university education, creating an active and engaged citizenry with habits of mind like careful deliberation, critical thinking, tolerance, and open-mindedness. Although this argument is common, it is not the one I want to rely on today. Apart from anything else, there's an obvious, if unexplored, tension between the egalitarian equality promoting foundations of democratic ideas and an argument that some privileged members of society are best placed to participate in it. Not all citizens attend university and cannot reasonably be claimed that a university education is necessary or sufficient for good citizenship. And I think it probably runs counter to research showing that part of the strength of democracy lies in bringing together multiple viewpoints, cognitive styles, and that, in other words, that show epistemic diversity is conducive to good decision-making. So I'll put that argument to one side because, in my view, universities support government much more powerfully through the provision of expertise and information. In part, this comes through the training of experts who themselves take part in government. I'm thinking of public servants, policymakers, judges, high-level administrators, or ways in which they enable other experts to hold government accountable. I'm thinking of journalists and lawyers, among others. So university expertise informs and enables policymaking as well. And that is a foundation for good governmental decision-making. But the most important form of democratic support provided by universities is neither through the education of students nor the provision of expertise directly to government, but the provision of university knowledge to the citizenry as a whole. A critical part of democratic government relies upon the participation of an informed citizenry in public discourse, and then ultimately in electing governments and in holding them to account. The complexity of modern governance is such that at any time, the kinds of questions we're asked to consider as part of our public life require a sophisticated knowledge base. Universities, as producers of reliable, independent knowledge, are essential, therefore, to produce what Robert Post has termed democratically competent citizens, and to enable them to exercise an informed judgment about their government. The provision of this kind of information is what has been termed the epistemic infrastructure of democracy. And to this, I would add that universities offer at least some prospect of overcoming some of the pathologies of modern politics. A great challenge for contemporary discourse lies in the ease of deception of digital communication, the breakdown of trust in the legacy media fed by circumstances of political polarisation, so that we have opposing political forces increasingly presenting a competing version of the facts. In these circumstances, the independence and reliability of disciplined university research may be one of the few ways we have to progress political arguments. Of all the connections between universities and democracy is this one on which I place most emphasis. The other features of the university's social role, economic driver, promoter of equality and supporter of civil society, are functions that other institutions perform as well. But advancing knowledge in the distinctive and independent ways that universities do it is a role that only universities universities perform well. And this returns us to the nature of academic inquiry and to the importance of academic freedom. So let me make the link to academic freedom explicit. If universities are essential infrastructure for democracy, then academic freedom, because it ensures the conditions necessary for independent, reliable research and teaching, academic freedom is democratic infrastructure too. Now, this conclusion should alert us to the vulnerabilities of universities. If universities are necessary for democracy, it is not surprising that they are threatened when democracy is threatened. As authoritarianism rises in other parts of the world, attacks on universities and scholars are part of that authoritarian playbook. Consider Poland, Hungary, Brazil, and India, all places in which we see at once rising authoritarianism and rising attacks on universities and individual scholars. Even where, as in our own country, democracy is for the moment well embedded, there are threats. We can see elements of right-wing parties in even quite a healthy democracy like ours, who tend to paint universities as the home of degenerate elites and seek to undermine a belief in expertise. This is combined with threats of a more traditionally neoliberal type, like treating universities like other corporate private bodies and governing them as such without reference to academic values. So we should be concerned about the unacceptable level of polarization in the public discussion of universities, even in our own country. And we should recognise some of the attacks on it as attacks that are driven by a desire to attack those very institutions and those very people who powerfully hold government to account. Now, clearly here, the most egregious thing that we have seen in recent years has been use of ministerial veto in relation to ARC grants. It obviously involves ad hoc decision-making and unacceptable politicisation. And I note also that the rhetoric around it, which tends to trivialise the research involved, reflects both neoliberal commodification of research and a populist denial of academic freedom. Populist denial of academic expertise. The big question, of course, is what the response is to all of this. And there need to be many responses, not the least of which is a greater consciousness in academic communities of academic freedom, the threats to it, and its significance to universities and our democracy. But let me return to my discipline of constitutional law for a moment. In circumstances of global democratic decay, constitutionalists are turning their attention to consider two new questions. One is the nature of constitutional institutions, and there is an increasing focus on what we are now calling fourth branch institutions, integrity institutions that hold government accountable. Indeed, many modern constitutions explicitly constitutionalise and entrench fourth branches of government, such as electoral management bodies, anti-corruption agency, and ombudsman's offices. The second focus that you see among constitutional scholars is on the conditions for successful government. There is renewed emphasis on considering not just what constitutions do by way of structuring and limiting government, but what they enable governments to do as well. The most ambitious claims are that the very concept of a constitution, or perhaps even of the rule of law, requires that a constitution enable a government to act in a way that promotes the well-being of its people. And other arguments focused on the kinds of mechanisms that can assure the aims and values of constitutionalism are realised. Now, my focus on universities as institutions of democracy responds to both these concerns. It recognises that they play a special institutional role. They are not equivalent to integrity institutions, but I think that they can be grouped with some other institutions, including independent government offices, as knowledge institutions, and here I draw on the work of Professor Vicky Jackson. And equally, and in addition to conceiving of universities as constitutional institutions, analogous to integrity institutions, we need to focus on the conditions in which universities thrive, because they just as they nurture democracy, they depend on the very democracy that they nurture. Now, if we think about universities, and this is my final point, as constitutionally significant institutions and academic freedom as a constitutional principle, we'll have a better appreciation of its significance and at what is at stake in attacks on academic freedom and on universities. So when we defend academic freedom, we are defending not a special pleading designed to make all of our lives more interesting, but a principle of democracy that is operating for the public good. Thank you very much. I do look forward to having some engagement with you on these issues.
Well, there's a lot in there, and we have two discussants to address that. The first, and I'm hoping the screens, yes, there we have Raewyn Connell coming to us on Zoom from Sydney. Hello, I'm glad that you're here. Raewyn will be known to many of us here. She's Professor Emerita at the University of Sydney and a life member of the NTEU. Her books are very well known. She's taught in several countries, but I want to refer particularly here to her recent book, The Good University, which I think forms a basis for some of her comments. So over to you, Raewyn, to respond and discuss.
Good, thanks very much. I hope I'm coming through okay. Yes. Excellent. Thanks to Adrienne Stone for that argument for academic freedom, which I found very affecting. I think it is, in fact, the best defence of academic freedom I've ever heard. So I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion. I think it's very helpful to think about university work as part of the infrastructure for democracy, so to speak, and against the vast tide of commitment to intellectual property rights. I think it's very helpful to think of research-based knowledge as materialised in our research and also in our teaching as public goods, at least up to a point. And that's, I have 3 points basically to make, and that is the first one. Public good, yes, I'm convinced of that, but public good is a concept that can be mythologized a bit if we assume that because it's public, it's equally available to all groups in the public. And I don't think this is the case. I argue, in fact, that the goods of research-based knowledge, whether research or teaching, are in fact very unequally available to different parts of the public. That the university system, both in particular countries and on a world scale, is very hierarchical and in many ways socially exclusive. And that poses a certain problem for basing a defence of academic freedom on that notion of a public good. And it puts a certain pressure on universities, I think, which is clear in the populist attacks on universities or university staff as elites, which are always contrasted in that rhetoric with the real people down there, who are, of course, going to vote for the next right-wing authoritarian to come along, at least in that rhetoric. So it puts a pressure on universities, in effect, to earn support for their academic freedom, for their material resources, for their public funds, and their long-term assets, such as the land that they're built on. We need to earn support for those by action to equalise the spread of these public goods. And that is something we are still a long way from succeeding at. My second thought is a point in which I actually disagree with Adrienne. I would argue that academic freedom is not just for academics or a few other people whose working lives look like that of academics. I think, although that is the usual assumption in discussions of academic freedom, it's based on much too individualistic an idea of how research and teaching are actually done. What are the actual practices through which research-based knowledge is produced and then circulated through teaching and research and outreach? This is something that I argue for in the book that was so kindly mentioned, The Good University. And I remind you that it's only less than 150 days to Christmas. That if we think about the actual everyday reality of teaching, of research, of the outreach that we do, all are produced by collective labour involving many groups beyond just the academics. That is, in effect, involving the whole workforce of universities, the professional staff, the administrative staff, the maintenance staff, all of those with whom the academics interact silently or verbally during their working day and their working week, and whose work is necessary to produce the academic effects of research and teaching. That whole workforce, it seems to me, is the subject that we must think about when we are discussing academic freedom, because that whole workforce needs protection from coercion, whether it's from outside the university sector or from university managements or wherever it might come from. That is part of a healthy research and teaching culture, the sustainability and the well-being of the whole workforce that is involved in those processes. So if we're being realistic about how university research is and teaching and outreach are really done, I don't think we can confine the concept of academic freedom only to academics. My third thought is where I am in agreement with Adrienne. Thinking of the constitutional support for universities as a resource for the whole society as a public good in the long term, and how we make that credible, or how that idea becomes credible in political and university practice. It does place a demand on universities, a demand for discussion of the purposes of these enterprises, and not just a technical repetition of ways that our work has been done, but a lively and continuing reconsideration of university work. And it also places a demand on the state and civil society, which is in a way beyond our capacity when we are university workers to achieve. It's a demand on our interlocutors, if you like, in this policy space. But it is a demand to value the knowledge and the work that creates knowledge and understanding, a demand to value critique, the development of understanding over the long run, and not just the short run where you can cash out the benefits or costs of any particular piece of research or teaching. So, in effect, what I'm suggesting here is that the discussion about academic freedom, accepting Adrienne's line of argument about it, becomes part of the wider agenda of deepening democracy in the societies that hope to have lively and sustainable higher education and research systems. And for that wider action to follow, to be encouraged, it seems to me that it's incumbent on university people, all of us, not just the academics, but the university staff more widely, to be concerned to connect our work and our institutions with other democratic institutions and social movements. So it has to do here, I guess, with our long-term thinking about what knowledge is for, what value of education and research and critical thinking and cultural imagination. The values of these for a whole society are indeed the context for the specific issue of academic freedom. Thank you.
And then our next speakers are here in real life. So we're going. I'd like to introduce Stephen Parker, a lawyer by background, Dean of Law at Monash University and later Vice-Chancellor at the University of Canberra. His research interests have covered legal ethics, contract law, justice reform, and he's worked in higher education. Come forward to the podium and we'll hear your views.
Thank you, Kate. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to comment on this interesting and thought-provoking paper which seeks to link academic freedom with democracy. I acknowledge the presence of former colleague John Dryzek in the audience and former Canberra associates such as Andrew Podger. Slightly to my own surprise, I'm going to argue against what I think are Adrienne Stone's two main pillars, linking academic freedom and democracy in the first place, and then resting her justification on the role of academic disciplines. I think my arguments are mainly practical and tactical, and as it happens, they were foreshadowed in Adrienne's final comment. I think most people would think hers was special pleading from an elite seeking to make their lives more interesting and increasingly bound up in itself. And I don't think her arguments would win democratic support if pushed. Now, I realise this comes across as quite severe, and I don't mean to be severe, and I'll try and end on what I hope is a positive note about maybe just a better basis for grounding what I would call academic privilege. So firstly, the democracy connection. On a chilly night in May 2014, I queued up in a new building in Marcus Clark Street, Canberra, to go into the budget lockup. Something was a bit odd, more odd than usual. There were a couple of group of 8 vice-chancellors ahead of me getting very excited about something. I knew that there was something up. We went in and bounding onto the stage like a hyper Peter Pan was Christopher Pine, and he announced fee deregulation. And he scarpered pretty quickly after that, and he left it to an enthusiastically supportive senior departmental official, exactly the kind of university-educated public servant whom Adrienne says relays to the citizenry the benefits of a university education. There were to be cuts to operating grants, but universities could now charge domestic students fees to recoup their losses and go further if the market allowed it. Well, at the end of this session, I gathered at the back with a few other old stagers, some of whom were members of this academy, to agree solemnly what a disaster this was going to be, and I frankly expected a political furor over it. But over the weeks, none eventuated. Universities Australia clearly supported the policy, And so I started to oppose it, culminating in a speech which was televised at the University of Sydney. And because the media needed to show both sides of the argument, and I was the only one of 41 vice-chancellors who opposed fee deregulation, I ended up pretty busy. And I think one Monday evening, I was on 7:30, Four Corners and Late Line. Well, as you may remember, the whole thing fell over because I and others worked on Nick Xenophon in particular, but not before being denounced by Mr. Pine under parliamentary privilege, which is an absolute privilege. So why is this relevant? Well, the Abbott government was elected, clearly, in a compulsory voting system. The proposal very nearly got through, and it would have been a disaster for student equity, debt levels, the regions, and those research universities that hadn't benefited from as many decades of public funding as the Group of Eight. VCs were quite happy to go along with it, and actually there wasn't much of a stink from academics either about it. Now, the issue wasn't directly about academic freedom, but I reckon they would have sacrificed that too if real money was at stake, if it had been dangled properly. And if I'm wrong, this means that they will sell out students, but not their own right to say what they think. So if this is the democracy of which universities are infrastructural components in which Adrienne wants to buttress, count me out. And it seems strange to me that Adrienne should also invoke social mobility as part of our argument, because when push comes to shove, I don't think universities really care about it. I stress when push comes to shove. And I'll leave aside the awkward facts that social mobility has stalled and inequality has worsened exactly during the era of expansion of universities. Now, Adrienne may argue that entrenched academic freedom will promote a version of democracy that she likes, but I think this would just be bootstrapping. So I don't think democracy takes you anywhere useful with regard to academic freedom. And then secondly, the discipline connection. Adrienne concedes her account of academic freedom is heavily reliant on the idea that academic inquiry pursues knowledge in distinctive ways through disciplines that are characterized by methods and standards designed to ensure expertise and independence. I'm quoting. Disciplinary methods and standards make university research unique, she says, whereas journalists, think tanks, commercial research organizations may aim to advance knowledge, but they don't have the independence of academics. An American historian, Chad Wellman, has written a fascinating account of the founding of the University of Berlin in 1810. He, and others before him, argue that during the 1700s, the age of reason, universities were increasingly irrelevant. The major discoveries and new ideas were coming from elsewhere, from new learned societies, from an explosion of new journals and encyclopediae, from public town hall debates. Universities had lost their epistemic authority, but von Humboldt, Kant and others reversed the tide with the University of Berlin, putting discovery at the heart of things and modernizing teaching. Within a century, this was a dominant model, taking root in the USA with the founding of Johns Hopkins University in the 1870s, and then rising along with the rise of the university department. As part of this process, knowledge was increasingly subdivided. The disciplines had arrived, and they became increasingly distinct and specialized, with favored methodologies, their own epistemology, and a preferred set of regular questions. Academic tribes and territories, to use Tony Beecher's term. The disciplines helped organize enlightenment, to draw on the title of Chad Wellman's book, Organizing Enlightenment. They've dominated our world. Adrienne is apparently still in the thrall of it all, but I am no longer. And what comes can go. There are many possible examples, but stunning recently was the algorithm AlphaFold, developed by the DeepMind laboratory, owned by Google's parent company. In July 2022, DeepMind used machine learning to produce the structure of almost every protein known to science, in what a Nobel Prize-winning chemist has said will fundamentally change biological research. Before AlphaFold, scientists knew the structures of about 180,000 proteins. AlphaFold has unveiled 200 million, an extraordinary development happening outside a university, but probably by university graduates. A second example, many I think I could give, was in The Economist magazine last year about the arrival of data science to economics. So-called real-time economics, using big data from credit cards, restaurant reservations, cinema bookings, people's movements, tracked through Google Maps and so on, is seemingly explaining developments better than economic theory would have predicted, leading some academic economists to complain they're becoming data scientists. We're seeing the arrival of the electrocardiogram of the economy, leading to new teams of analysts forming outside of universities and generating new insights and theories. Now, this all puts me in mind of a joke by the late and lamented English comedian Barry Cryer. Pablo Picasso was once burgled, and Picasso told the police he'd seen the 3 burglars and he drew a picture of them. So the police immediately went out and arrested a horse and 2 sardines. Now, Picasso may have seen the burglars that way, but no one else did. So, as we enter a different age of enlightenment, driven by new technologies, the explanations and interpretations of the world produced and refracted by academic disciplines in the von Humboldt tradition of universities will seem as accurate as Picasso's picture of the burglars. So if we think about where will the discoveries, explanations and ideas that really change the world will come from, I'm not at all sure that universities will dominate in the future. I wouldn't therefore accept Adrienne's assertion that the value of academic research and the knowledge it produces seems to me, she says, to be manifold and obvious. In fact, that to me is the big challenge, the challenge facing discipline-based universities, institutions of the Anthropocene, of staying at or near the centre of knowledge production in the Novacene. My guess is that AI, using machine learning and harnessing super and then quantum computing, will upend the lenses of the world that disciplines have given us. Algorithms will trawl backwards and forwards across huge data sets, day and night, like relentless swimming pool crawlers, looking for patterns, links, causation, and so on. And before long, it'll be seen that those disciplines which make claims about human behaviour, about what causes what, about what will happen if something else happens, basically a good chunk of the social sciences, I think will be outgunned by alternative accounts not relying on the input of disciplinary thinking. They will cease to be the dominant producers of reliable knowledge, to use Adrienne's term. So from a tactical point of view, to argue that academic freedom is essential to democracy because academics, unlike think tanks, have been anointed with a discipline like a laying on of hands is the last kind of argument I personally would put forward if I wanted to strengthen its protection, which I do. So I said I'd end on a more positive note. I think a better basis for academic freedom than the democracy argument is simply liberal values. I used to think that markets, democracy and liberalism were bound up together in a kind of triple helix, but now I know they aren't. There are market societies that are illiberal, and so too democracies. So we could take a J.S. Mill view. Academics should be allowed to do what they wish unless it causes harm to others, so that academic freedom is a version of freedom of thought and expression. Or we could take a rule utilitarian approach. It does more good than harm, and because we can't examine and weigh up every instance of it, we need a rule simply to protect it. I'd even be interested in further legal protection of academic freedom, but I'd recast it as a qualified privilege to be asserted defensively in qualifying circumstances comparable with legal professional privilege. And a virtue of this approach, finally, is that universities would have to keep justifying their contribution to discovery and innovative thinking to preserve the rule. and they'll have a hard time of it with new knowledge production technologies sweeping over us. But that's as it should be, a privilege always in need of justification. So I would keep things simple. Academics in universities established for public purposes have a qualified privilege to write, speak, and think according to their academic judgment, and that privilege should be maintained for so long as the benefits are demonstrated to outweigh the disbenefits, particularly to students and the end users of the knowledge that universities produce. It's my response.
Okay. Now, I'm sure that there may be questions and comments. Raewyn is back on our Zoom, and we're starting here. Thank you.
Bob Stimson, Universities of Queensland and Melbourne. I'm a geographer. I'm surprised that there was no mention, I couldn't at least discern any mention through the presentations, of the issue to do with tolerance in universities. Because I think that we have a lot of evidence, unfortunately, over recent years of the growth of intolerance among the academy and among students, and people being castigated for having contrarian views, at least the views that some people hold. Would any of the panel like to comment on that?
Do you want to, Raewyn, or any comments?
Shall I step in whilst Raewyn is responding? Tolerance. I think probably I would pick up Adrienne's comment at the beginning that she defined academic freedom as including the ability to criticise the university administration. That doesn't exhaust tolerance, but it's an example of whether tolerance is stretched or not, I think. I don't have a particular problem with it. If, however, we are going to say that academic privilege or freedom has to be in an area of academic expertise, then I think that is a difficulty for it, because with respect, not every academic that I've encountered is a management expert. So I'm just not sure about that. I mean, I'm fine about freedom of speech. If it doesn't harm anyone else, I don't have a particular problem with it. But I think I do have a problem in defining academic freedom explicitly to include criticism of one's colleagues, probably senior colleagues, but it could be junior colleagues. It doesn't really matter, unless that is within the area of academic expertise and an academic debate that is on foot at the time.
Okay, any other?
Okay.
Yep, Jane? Oh, sorry, Raewyn, did you want to comment on the tolerance?
That's right. No, let's go on.
Thanks. Jane Hall, UTS, and I'm an economist, which is also part of the social sciences, although not always recognised in comments. But I did want to pick up the point about, and would like comments from both of you about universities proving their relevance and their value. And I think what we see, and have seen particularly over the last few years, is a lot of short-termism about this. If your graduates aren't employed in the next 12 months, tough luck, you're doing the wrong thing. If your research doesn't lead preferably to patents and commercialisable outcomes, tough luck, you're doing the wrong thing. And it does seem to me that part of our responsibility is to think long-term and to be ahead, with all due respect to my friend here, Andrew Podger, to be ahead of the policymakers in thinking about what the issues are on which we should be creating knowledge and instructing students.
Raewyn, do you have a response to that?
Sure. I think that has, identified a really quite important issue. It is part of. I mean, I hesitate to use the words like neoliberalism, but it is part of the market outlook. To use another phrase, at least in the last generation, since perhaps the 1970s, 80s, to focus much more on short-term gains than was, if you like, the principal model of understanding the corporate world in the generation before. And that has now affected, the rhetoric, if you like, of policy and policy decisions, as we see in episodes like the Job Ready Graduates policy agenda of the coalition last year. And if we buy into that, then I guess we risk falling into the age-old problem of learning to the test. That if the test is, how much can be raised from corporate grants or even government grants in competitive grant environments, or how many clicks we get on the university's website, etc., where we wind up in some kind of ranking scale, then we are simply not doing well with what I take, and I think most colleagues would take to be central purpose of universities, which is doing the long-term thinking or enabling the long-term thinking to happen through our educational work. And that's a harder sell in the current, political culture. But I think it's one that people understand. I don't think it's an impossible sell at all. That it does connect, if you like, with the problem. It's not just unique to universities, which is in the back of all of our heads, I guess, thinking about democracy and institutions, which is the problem of apparently declining trust in institutions generally and democratic institutions in particular. If we do have a good case to be made about the value of universities, it has to connect with that issue of the long-term development of knowledge and the culture. And if you will excuse me for commenting also on Stephen's remarks about there, yes, there have always been other centres of knowledge production and dissemination besides universities. The Humboldt model, which was, of course, not only the University of Berlin developed that in the early 19th century, but that's just the famous example. But at the same time, for instance, in France, when the Germans were doing that move, the French had invented the Research Institute, if you like, or the Institute of Advanced Studies, which became the basis of another institutional model of research and knowledge development, which eventually became the Soviet model and the post-colonial Indian model and so forth. And the problem with those autonomous, if you like, research centres, and a problem I would immediately see in the corporate research institutes that Stephen's argument implicitly mentioned and values, is that they ultimately depend on universities too, because they can't reproduce their own workforce, and universities have exactly that task. So universities will matter, but how much trust and support they get depends very much on the way university people themselves address these questions of equity, inclusion and long-term relevance.
Thank you. Do you want to
Quickly,
Yeah.
a couple of things. I could have said it about Adrienne's paper, but I didn't because of time. But Australia, I think, of all OECD countries, has the most research coming out of universities. So most other systems have research institutes, scientific and non-scientific, and so we're heavily weighted towards the university as the producer of research. And I think Adrienne's argument would have to encompass the way that things happen in other countries and not just Australia. I agree with the long-term point. The incentive system in higher education is all wrong. It's all completely out of kilter. And it's not just about long-term, it's about doing major things tied up with long-term. But I think less would be more in higher education. If there was less output, but it was more significant, weighty things that people could really grapple with, rather than the drip feeding of small-scale studies, which look a bit feeble sometimes. And I say this is previously connected with the conversation. Some of the things that come out in that, I'd probably just hold them back until I'd got something bigger and meaty to release. I actually think that would improve the standing of universities. So not just long term, but larger scale as well, I'd go.
Okay, now look, our time is very tight, but if we want to go on for a few more minutes, I've got one question.
My main question is, it was rather tangential to this, and I won't jump to what Jane raised from me, Sandra Podger here, was the academic freedom issue is becoming a more important issue for those who are engaging with people in other countries that are authoritarian, and trying to develop what are the principles which allow us to engage and engage with confidence. Could you talk a little bit about what you think those principles are that we need to take into account when we are trying to engage with authoritarian regimes and their institutions?
Searching question. At the moment, I think that the restrictions on some kinds of foreign research and researchers are more politically motivated than motivated by scholarship. I think it's been tied up in exactly the kinds of wars that Adrienne and Raewyn were thinking about, and I think we should resist it to the extent possible. And if in our academic judgment we think we're dealing with a scholar that has sufficient independence of mind and does actually really mean what they're saying and doing, rather than having been put up to it or circumscribed, then we should collaborate with them, and that should be a site of fighting back, really, of struggle.
Yeah. Now, look, I'm afraid that I do have to close the session, but I'd just like to thank Adrienne in her absence, but also Raewyn and Stephen for waking us up in the afternoon and leaving us with lots of things to think about. So thank you very much.